All right, so this is our next to last class. Next Wednesday will be our last class for studying the Christian home and family. So I've got lesson 7, emailed it out. They're in the back. They were out there on Sunday, but didn't email them out until this evening. So we'll work with lesson 6 tonight on parenting and hopefully get through the majority of that. So that'll save us a little bit of time for lesson 7 next week. So question number 1 says, read Exodus 20, verse 12, Deuteronomy 5, verse 16, and Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 4. And then I asked the question, what does it mean to honor father and mother? How serious were the consequences for those that did not honor father and mother? So what does it mean to honor father and mother?
In the Lord, and so they will live long, he said.
Okay, so there's definitely this sense of obedience that we've got from honoring father and mother. Ken?
I was just going to say respect them and take care of them in their old age.
Okay, so there's a sense of respect. So dealing with just younger children, let's stick with that for right now, the honoring part of it. So respect, we've got obedience. What else? Norm, did you raise your hand?
I think it's important to teach them even at a young age to appreciate what mom and dad do for them on a daily basis, to not take it for granted, to show respect in that way, and I know there's the idea with honor to value our parents, and that's something you do when they're older too, but I think you begin to instill that in the hearts of children as they're young.
Okay. So there's a certain sense of thankfulness or gratitude toward your parents and what they've done. What else? So I brought up Exodus 20, verse 12, and what's that entail, that passage? All right, so let's talk about the 10 Commandments. Has anybody ever paid attention? So anybody know what the first 4 commands, kind of what they're centered, who they're centered on? All right, so the first 4 commands are centered on God and worship of God. So you should have no other gods before him. You must not make any graven image that would be worshipped or treated in the image of God. You must keep God's name holy. You must keep the Sabbath day holy. And then the final 6 are really dealing with treatment of other people, I guess we'll say. But in regard to our treatment of other people, you see what the very first one is? So we've got everything that deals with God and his worship, and then the very next one is honor your father and mother. And so I think that there definitely is this idea of respect and obedience to what they tell you to do. Over in Colossians chapter 3, Paul, he says this. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with the promise that it may go well with you, that you may live long in the land. And that's actually in Ephesians. And then Colossians, it's just children, obey your parents and everything, for this pleases the Lord. So is it just, though, obedience? So if we tell our child to do something and then they obey, then that's all that really is required with that? In what way could obedience not be all right? Norm?
Well, it's like the parable about the 2 sons, and one went out and did what the father said, but and he was complaining the whole time, and the other one didn't do it first, but then went out and did it afterwards after thinking about it for a little bit. So the attitude is behind it is what God is interested in. He's not so interested in the action, although you should do the action, as the Bible would tell us. But it's the attitude behind it, and he wants the heart. And so the father wants the heart of the child to want to do or learn to want to do it.
Yes, so that would be obedience without honor. All right, so yeah, we can huff and gruff about doing what we're told to do, and that's not honoring our parents. And so there is this idea, too, of reverence to go along with the respect. So how serious were the consequences for those that didn't honor father and mother? We really need our kids up here for this.
That's
It's going to do us a lot of good.
It's a death penalty.
All right, Mr. Harris said kill them. All right, so, yeah, the consequences were pretty severe. So this wasn't one of the questions, and Ken had already mentioned honoring them in their old age. So I was just going to ask the question, how long do children have to honor their parents? When does that end? When does that requirement stop? Okay. So, we may have this thought or this idea that, well, when I become 18 in our society, that means you're a man or you're a woman, or maybe it's 21. There's this arbitrary line of where now I'm on my own, and maybe we think that, okay, at that point, I don't necessarily owe my parents anything, but that's not entirely true. So go ahead and turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. So I was going to deal with this in the last lesson, but we're kind of adding it in here since we're talking about honoring father and mother. And while you're turning there, I'm just going to read. So this definitely should be a lifelong expectation. But in Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, it says, Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat. He answered them, And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded, Honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. This is Jesus rehashing the consequences of what would happen. But you say, If anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God. He need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. And he's not talking to children here. He's talking to adults that are no longer honoring their father and mother because of tradition. So 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4. Go ahead and read that, Ken.
But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God.
All right, what's that word piety mean? Humility? Godliness? Okay. I'm not sure where we're getting the feedback. Anything, it's off my shirt. Yeah, I can hang it from some of the hairs on my beard. So, piety has this idea of devotion, and one of the definitions is obligations, fulfilling obligations, and the definition actually includes as to parents. So we have this obligation to parents. Thayer's defines it as to act piously or reverently towards God, one's country, magistrates, relations, and all to whom dutiful regard or reverence is due. Well, that's going to include our parents. And so we have this command, really, that we're going to show piety. We're going to give this devotion. We're going to continue to give this honor to our parents. It says, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. And so there's no point in our lives as children where we're not going to honor our father and mother. Now, does that mean that once we have established our own family that we always do what our father and mother says? I saw one person shake their head no, but then I thought I heard I don't know. Norm?
There's a respectful way to do everything, and that's got to be the top consideration that's there. It's the manner in which you attack the matter that's important in this case.
Yes. Yeah, obviously, we should never stop listening to our parents, because regardless of how old we are, our parents are always going to be older, and so they're going to have more experience in whatever the situation may be. And so we should always be respectful and listen to them. But when it's your family, you've got to be able to make the decisions. Drew? All right, let's move on to number 2. So consider 2 Timothy 3, verses 14 and 15. What do we learn from this passage about how Timothy's mother and grandmother raised him, and what must have been a part of his raising? What do we learn from the phrase from childhood? So just starting off there, what do we learn from about how Timothy's mother and grandmother raised him? Okay, in the Holy Scripture. So, yeah, the New American Standard says the sacred writings, which are able to give you wisdom. So he was raised in that. What else?
It's not in that passage that you are mentioning, but earlier saying that the grandmother first had the great faith, and so this is why you have the great faith. So I would say he was raised with big faith.
Okay, so with that, the parents and the grandparents are displaying their faith, and so there's this example that's being set for him. Bonnie?
It also mentions that, he's become convinced of these things. So it's not just, well, we took him to church, or we maybe told him some stories. There was probably some actual teaching going along with that in order to convince him of this faith.
So Lena mentioned the faith of his mother and his grandmother, and what do we see now displayed here? It's Timothy's faith. So that's a really good thing that we have to recognize and understand as parents, is we might have the greatest faith in the world, but that doesn't do any good. We can't pass on part of that faith to our child. They have to develop their own faith. They have to be convinced in their own mind, and so that is something that is very critical. So with this idea of from childhood knowing the sacred writings, what do you think had to have been a part of his raising?
You have to start early.
Start what?
You have to start teaching early.
All right, start teaching early. So when they're super young, what does that entail?
Reading Bible stories to them.
All right, so reading. What else? Singing. What else? Praying. All right, so regardless of whether or not they may fully comprehend or understand, we're doing all of these things from a very, very early age. So 1 Peter 2 verse 2 says, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, so that by it you may grow in respect to salvation. Well, we're wanting growth, and so we're trying to feed them. We're trying to nourish them spiritually from the very beginning. 1 Timothy 4:13 says, until I come, give attention to public reading of Scripture, to exhortation and teaching. Joshua 1 verse 8 says, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have success. And then we've referred to Deuteronomy 6, 5 through 7 several times. And so there's this idea of reading, and this is one of the things that I remembered vividly from the Waldron's material, A Generation That Knows Not God. From the very earliest of age, they had a section, and it was like, read to your baby. Read, read, read. So even in their book, they talked about, take every opportunity to talk to your baby about spiritual things. And they say changing diapers at mealtime, fixing supper, folding clothes at the grocery store, traveling in the car, and on and on and on and on. So with this question that I have about childhood, the New American Standard Version there in verse 15 says, in that from childhood you have known the sacred writings. So what do we learn about from the phrase from childhood? What does that phrase actually mean? All right, Ken said from a very young age at least. Marissa?
It's continuous. It's not just at a certain age. It is from a very young age until.
Okay. So one of the interesting things about that word childhood, the Greek word which is like brephos, I think. It actually means an unborn or a newborn child, a baby, an infant, and then Thayer's says an unborn child, embryo, a fetus, a newborn child, an infant, a babe. So we're talking the earliest of the early. All right, and that's the point that I think we need to get. It's not, well, my kid can't read yet, so, you know, there's no point in really going over these stories, at least until they are able to read, or they're not really able to understand this, and so maybe we need to wait until they can at least understand, you know, what we're trying to, no, from the very beginning. And it's not just because we bring them to worship services, it's because we are taking the time to teach them, to read to them, to sing to them, to pray with them from the moment that they are conceived. So it's and as Marissa said, that's an ongoing process, and so that starts from the very beginning, and it doesn't necessarily end whenever they leave our house either. All right, anything else on question number 2? Norm?
It just it describes how complete that this process is. As God looks at it, is parenting starts before you're a parent. It starts back in the generations of you being brought up to then be a parent, and then the process of preparing to be a parent is part of parenting, and because you just don't learn it overnight. It's observation. It's the little babysitting jobs that you do. Maybe it's taking care of younger siblings. God really looks at it as a full thing, and it's not just, well, okay, now the baby's here. Now it's time to start learning how to be a parent.
Yeah. Jesse?
And you see the goal and purpose of doing this is to make them wise into salvation in Christ Jesus.
Yep. So we mentioned
That's
that
all about.
at the end of last class. We brought them into this world, and they're going to spend an eternity somewhere. So we need to make them wise into salvation. All right, question number 3. How is it possible that Hophni and Phinehas grew up in the home of the high priest, yet did not know the Lord? 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. I mean, wouldn't you have expected that the sons of the high priest, like those, it's like preacher's kids, you know? I mean, those are always going to be the best, right? The PKs. Marissa?
Just because they're present doesn't mean they're listening.
Just because they're present doesn't mean they're listening. All right?
They were self-seeking.
They were self-seeking. Norm?
We can't, common mistake made, we cannot assume that our faith is just going to transfer by osmosis. It's obvious that Eli knew how to teach because Samuel was in the same house with Phinehas and Hophni. Yet Samuel knew the Lord. And Samuel was there as a servant to Eli. And yet Samuel still knew the Lord. So he didn't just magically get that either. That wasn't just something, oh God, boom, now you know all about me. It was, he learned that from Eli. Eli simply just assumed his kids would automatically pick this up, apparently. Because there was evidently effort put into teaching Samuel what needed to be done. And he's not even a priest. Can't even be a priest. Wrong tribe. But his own sons, he did not take the time to instill the same types of things that apparently he did in Samuel. So it's not in there, but it's just from the evidence of what occurred between them, that he in the same house of those two, who God was like, you're going to die, and I'm going to curse your entire family because of them and what you failed to do. From that same household came Samuel.
So you're telling me if you're a child of a preacher or the child of an elder, you're not automatically going to be faithful?
Nope.
So what was missing? What did Eli not do, Andy?
Correct them.
All right.
In chapter 3 and in verses 13, it says, and he did not restrain them.
So what's the D word we talked about last week?
Discipline.
There was none. All right. And something that I think is interesting is this is something that was well known. And obviously God knew about it, but it was well known even amongst the people. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 22, it says, "Now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women and served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He said to them, 'Why do you do such things? The evil things that I hear from all these people.'" So it's being told to him from all of these people. Everybody knows what's going on. Verse 24, "No, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear the Lord's people circulating." So, I mean, it'd be like, the preacher's kid or the elder's kid, and they're doing something, and everybody in the congregation knows about it, and nothing's being done about it. Verse 25, "If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor both with the Lord and with men." So he knew what was going on, but then as Andy read there in verse 13, he didn't do anything about it. So the discipline was not there. And so just because, we think that our faith is strong doesn't mean that is going to then, as Norm said, through osmosis, transfer to our children. Go ahead, Clarissa.
And part of the discipline that we studied too was not just punishing when they do something wrong, it's training them. And so they were obviously not being trained or impressed upon how important, following God was. And it's easy to happen. I mean, all the wonderful things that God did with the children of Israel, and then when they go in and take the land, and as soon as Joshua and all of that generation die, the next generation didn't know the Lord. I mean, so it's got to be passed on. It's got to be talked about and pressed upon how important it is.
So it's an ongoing process that has got to happen. Does anybody remember what other thing happened when Hophni and Phinehas died? Something was taken. The Ark of the Covenant was taken. That's over in 1 Samuel chapter 4. But yeah, they did end up dying because of it. Anything else on question number 3? Jesse?
Them not knowing the Lord, obviously they knew of God. I would say they probably believed in God. They're serving as priests. I think it's more of they didn't obviously have a relationship with the Lord. They did not have their own faith. Eli had faith. He failed as a father, obviously, but it's just the idea, didn't know the Lord. I don't think they knew him. I think probably believed in him. They just didn't fear him, reverence him, serving themselves, and having faith in him like their father did.
Yeah, like you said, there wasn't a relationship there. Yeah, they definitely knew him. They did not have that relationship. Sam?
And I guess the last verse that was read, where it says that they didn't listen to their father because the Lord desired their lives. I guess that reminds me of what's said in Romans chapter 1 about how you have individuals who know the truth but refuse to adhere to it, then that they become, I guess they become callous in that way. They gain that reprobate mind, I think is what my translation says. But like there's a point where if you don't train your kids, I guess what I gather is that they just might not have the ability to be convinced. Like they can go too far off the deep end to where they're irredeemable in that way.
Yep. JJ?
There's a balance of duties. You mentioned before about Jethro and his advice to Moses, because Moses was about the work of the Lord. You see it in the parable of the Good Samaritan too, the priest and the Levite, and they had to be about their business, where they had time for the riffraff or whatever. And I think that you can be anything to an extreme, if that makes sense, and neglect the other duties that you have. Jesus talks about the weightier matters and so forth. Not that they should have neglected the littler things, but that you have to be about that balance. And it's hard, when you've got a lot going on to prioritize, and sometimes you priorities shift on the fly, depending on what's going on. And I think that's probably part of it. Eli, just think that there was an imbalance, and maybe he gave more time over here than he should have, and neglected some household things, for example.
Yeah, he may have been the number one high priest there ever was, but he failed as a father. So you have to be careful. All right, number 4. What can we learn about parenting from Hebrews 5, verse 14? And actually backing up to verse 13, it says, "For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant, but solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil." So what can we learn about parenting from that?
Good from evil.
Teaching good from evil. Okay.
What is appropriate for their age?
Okay. Things that are age appropriate. Marissa?
There should be a progression. So just because we start out appropriately for 3 years old, when they're 4, we should bump up to 4. And so
Yes. So we have to treat and train and discipline every age differently. And there should be this sense of this of growth or of maturity, and just this idea of partaking of milk. Obviously, that's for infants. And I think about our baby goat because we're feeding her a whole lot of milk. But eventually, it's like we got to quit feeding her milk because we can't afford all this milk. She's got to start being able to eat hay. All right. Well, our children, they're going to start off, and as we said, they're not going to be able to read. They're not going to be able to understand and comprehend everything. But we're still we have to train them in certain ways. But we're not going to train and discipline a 2-year-old the same way that we would a 12-year-old. And so if we're now trying to teach and train and discipline our teenagers the way that we did when they were toddlers, then we're messing up. So there has to be this ongoing training process that changes depending upon their age, and sometimes maybe even depending upon their own experiences and personalities. And so it's a fluid situation, but we're trying to get them from milk to meat in life. And so we've got to be able to make those adjustments as parents. Ms. Lou?
When you said that it starts from birth and on, I've been thinking about that. And, it's not like you're going to take a 1-year-old or whatever and get them to say who the apostles were or whatever, I think if you think about it, what's important from birth is teaching them the difference between good and bad, and then teaching them to respect you, because when you teach them to respect you, you're teaching them how to respect a higher power, and that is teaching them about God in the very basics. So it goes from there.
Yeah. Andy?
Well, I know you know what this verse is talking about, but these set of verses, spiritually or in the class this evening, it's a progression. So, not just as the person, but even maybe the punishment, because as a baby, you're not going to use the same punishment, and so either you learn as you've been instructed, or the punishment gets more severe as you get older and you're still doing the same thing. That's the way that I would see it. Say me and you were probably kind of in the same boat. Our punishment got worse even when we were older. Me and my brother, we got in probably the biggest scuffle fight that we were ever in. We were in high school. I could drive, so stupidity is overwhelming. And so somebody went through the stair banister, and two pretty good sized boys fighting. And whenever Dad come home, he said, "I just want you to know," he said, "I can still whip both of you." He said, "But I'm not going to do that." He said, "You've got till the end of the summer to write me a book report from a novel that you read." He knew we hated to read. And that's probably one of the worst punishments that I ever got as a kid. I'll probably never forget that because I hate to read. And could he have whipped us? Yeah. But would it have done any good? Probably not. But having to read that book and write him that report, Mercy, that killed me.
I've been begging for the whipping. Just whip me now.
My dad told me he quit me after I was married.
Okay, we'll talk about that one at the last question. Is that all right? Let's move on to question 5. So I say read Luke 2, 41 through 52. What 4 areas of life did Jesus grow, and what can we learn from this? So what are the 4 areas of life that Jesus grew
in? Wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and men.
Okay, so I think we have a pretty good grasp on wisdom. What's stature?
Height, I guess it means his height, which might also include his health.
Okay. What else might it mean besides height? Because hopefully, as he's growing, he's going to grow physically. And what else does that word entail?
Probably a maturity.
There's this idea of maturity. If you look up the definition in Thayer's, it actually mentions.
This is right after he got lost. Well,
Right.
He wasn't lost. His parents had lost him, but
Yeah. And then what about this idea of favor?
The people that he was studying with there were impressed with his knowledge and what he had learned, and so that was impressive, especially for his age, for the same reasons he would have grown in favor with God. That's,
So what do you think we can learn about just parenting and children from this, from what we see in Jesus' growth?
the 12-year-olds are capable of more than some people think.
That's one for sure.
I just remember reading some of my American history and finding out some of what our early founder people were doing at 13 years old. Their father was dead. They were running a farm, etc. I mean, people are capable of a lot more. And a lot of times we try to put a finger on this age of accountability. And it is different for various people, and upbringing is part of that. But I mean, 12 years old, he understood what it meant to be about his father's business. That tells you something about the capacity that's in a person at that age.
Yes, I think that is both spiritually speaking, but also earthly speaking. I think we tend to baby, I guess, our children and don't give them the responsibility that maybe we should, thinking that they're too young, for sure.
the text tells us there that how close attention his mother was paying to this. So I wonder about the idea about, exactly how much influence that she had in his life, growing up, because I'm sure it was a lot. And he was still human, so he could have turned out to be like Eli's sons, but there was a good quality there that was not just because, but because it was also instilled in him, obviously.
Sam?
And it would just be guessing on my part, but that there could be an innocence that he did have as a child that would require that training up. So something tells me that Mary and Joseph didn't do too much reactive discipline, but maybe proactive discipline, that they would have been responsible for that as well.
Yeah. Bonnie?
To kind of go along with what Sam's saying, I mean, obviously as parents, we are responsible for all these different areas of our child's development. So there's a mental development, there's a physical development, a spiritual development, and a social development. And that's a lot. And we're kind of responsible for growing them up in all of those areas as parents.
Yes. And I think ultimately that's one of the points, because children don't have these things. Okay, children lack wisdom. We have to help them grow in that. Children lack this stature. They lack this maturity, and so we have to help them grow in that. They lack this favor with God in the sense of they're innocent, but in the sense that we're talking about here is growing in this love for God and their desire for God. And then they lack this favor with men. They lack the social skills to be able to operate in society, and so we have to teach them those things. And we can do a poor job in any of these areas and end up with a problem child. And so it's kind of all-encompassing here, what we see there with Jesus. All right, let's move on to question number 6. How do you handle an infant that is disruptive in worship services? So we'll answer that first, and then if it changes at all when they're a toddler. So how do you handle an infant that's disruptive?
Situational circumstances.
All right, so we're not going to go through a bunch of hypotheticals we don't have time to. So just in general terms, how do you handle an infant that's disruptive? Clarissa?
If you see that you can't get them under control, obviously, in the measures that you're trying to do right here at the pew, and they are, as you worded the question, becoming disruptive to the worship services, then I would get up and remove them until you could get them, take care of their needs, whatever needs that they're, if it's an infant, take care of their needs and get them calmed down, and then bring them back and sit down.
Okay. Ms. Shirley?
Well, when they're an infant, if they just are crying and you can't get them under control, then I would take them to the nursery and see if I could find out what the problem was and get them calmed down, and then I would come back.
Okay.
Toddler is a whole different story.
Okay. Before we get to toddler, does anybody have any other input on an infant?
You have to teach a toddler, so I don't think it's hard. I think it's okay to tap them a little bit on the mouth if they're talking and say you have to be quiet. And if they're wiggling and squirming, a little pat on the legs to let them know they have to stay in service. I don't think taking them out every time they make a whimper when their toddler is doing them any good. They've got to learn, they've got to sit still in the auditorium.
Okay. Ms. Sue?
I said that when they're infants, you just try to distract them or feed them or whatever they need, but you don't let them distract others from their worship.
Okay.
And one thing that I remembered when I was writing this was my dad always called the nursery, he always called it the cry room. And that gives you the idea of what it's for, so that you can take them out so they don't distract others, and then come back in when they're not crying.
Okay. Melissa?
My experience is that when kids are they're not distracting the crowd as much as they are their parents. And their parents will react to that, and they're so worried that they're going to distract somebody else. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It's not, a lot of times, I don't even notice, and somebody will say something about how bad their kids were in church, and I'm like, what did they do? I didn't see anything, because I think you are so sensitive to the fact that you're afraid your kids are going to distract other people that you actually.
You're hyper-focused.
Yes, you're hyper-focused on it, and it's not near. I mean, I can remember Rhonda Sharp when her kids were little. I mean, they would barely. I mean, they would twitch, and she would do something, and I'd be like, they didn't even move. I always thought, I'm gonna do that. No.
All right, other comments? We've opened it up to toddlers, so go ahead, Drew.
I was going to say on the other side of this also, other members of the congregation, we need to have grace with parents too.
Yes.
They're going through those things as well. So, I mean, I've never had somebody that was rude, but I have heard of instances where people have complained about toddlers and stuff, and that can be really destructive too. So.
What we've received is absolute love and sometimes smiles from those of y'all that had kids when we were in college, telling us that everything's good, and we appreciate that.
Norm?
If you're consistent with everything from the time that they're infants, by the time they get to be toddlers, they should know that there's a routine every week where you are and what's expected every week. Because every week you're doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. And if your demands are the same the entire time, over and over and over again, you're not mixing it up. There's a limit to how much they're allowed to do. There's a limit to how much they're allowed to get away with during this specific time. When they're toddlers, being able to take them, and when they get to the point where they're not going to behave because they're being rebellious, because they're toddlers, being able to then discipline them and bring them back in to let them know, hey, look, this is going to hurt because you know you shouldn't be doing this, because this specific time we've already been doing, it's set aside. And it was, both of my girls went through that phase of where they had to be taken out, and they would immediately quiet down as soon as they went to the back, because that's what they wanted. And then they found out that hurt. And that would happen every time they were not going to be quiet when they were sitting in front. And so once they realized that they couldn't do what they wanted to do during that particular time frame, and it took about a year each, but then they settled down. And being hyper-focused on it is an absolute thing. Like, it's just like, I really
So,
want to hear this.
the thing that I will just leave you with is, one, when you take them out, you don't reward them. All right, this isn't, I'm going to reward them just to try to get them to quiet down, so we're not going to take them out and give them a piece of candy because they're being disruptive in worship services. Obviously, if you reward negative behavior, what do you expect is going to happen the next Sunday? And also, make your trips as brief as possible. All right, we're not, because the sermons here are never boring, so that's not an excuse to go hang out in the cry room. So take them back, do what you got to do, discipline them, and come back, because this is where they need to be. And even if they're crying, even if you think that you've got a problem child, bring them to church. The worst thing you can do is get so embarrassed or so worried that you just decide you're going to stay home. That's the absolute wrong answer. And we got plenty of, if specifically speaking about here, we got plenty of people that will help you if you feel like you're overwhelmed. So, all right, so next week we're going to talk about the 11 B's for training children and for worship. And then we'll finish up 6 and finish up 7 too. Thanks, everybody.